I'm happy to be here and talk about assessment. It is an area that I can say when I graduated from the program, it wasn't something we necessarily spent a lot of time on around assessment in student services and really what assessment has become in terms of our own accreditation and what we're doing and those kinds of things, and or even having a lot of information about community colleges. So anytime I have an opportunity to talk about community colleges, I love that, so that you all can learn a little bit more about community colleges and our mission and what we do. So I did graduate from the SAHI program, and I immediately started working in community colleges. I started at the Community College of Denver, and I worked there for about 5 years. And then I had the opportunity to come up here in Fort Collins and work at Front Range Community College on our Larimer campus in student life and our student center. And so I ran our student center for about 6 years and then had the opportunity to become Dean of Student Services, did that for almost 10 years, and now my role is Associate Vice President of Enrollment and Student Success. What that means is that I'm now responsible for those things that happen outside the classroom, for all of our sites at Front Range Community College. And so just to let you know a little bit about Front Range, we serve approximately 30,000 students. We have campuses in Westminster, Longmont, which we call our Boulder County campus, and then up here in Larimer, Fort Collins, our Larimer campus up here in Fort Collins. And then we also have 2 centers, one in Loveland and one in Brighton. And our centers aren't really, they're not full service centers. It's really where we offer classes for students. And then about a fifth of our students are online, completely online. And so looking at assessment and working with those students is really important for us as well. And so for our institutional research department, even though we serve 30,000 students, we only have 3 people in our department. So it takes a lot of us to work together. We have an incredible IR department, love working with them. But we have a lot of folks across the campus who need to be involved in assessment. And I think if there's one thing to know about assessment is that it is something that should happen all over the college. We hear a lot about assessment as it relates to learning outcomes that have to do with the academic side of the house, but it is so incredibly important that student services is at the table. I'm going to call it student services because that's my realm. So student services, student affairs. In community colleges, we're kind of making that shift towards student affairs, and you'll see more and more titles being Vice President of Student Affairs, but we still talk a lot about it as being student services, so I kind of shift back and forth on that. And I know some of this you all have talked about, but what I think is important is that regardless of assessment, whether it's at a 4-year, a 2-year, a small college, a large college, it's assessment. And what is important about assessment and the fact that, a lot of times, especially in student affairs, we're not finding ourselves necessarily, it's not something that we come into the position thinking about, let me put it that way. Many times it is something that we're maybe at the last minute we're told, oh, can you do assessment around this? And yet it's really critical that we're thinking about assessment from the front end and not necessarily coming at it from a reaction perspective, but a proactive. And so some of this is from a brand new book that just came out, Beginning Your Journey. And so just sharing a couple of things that I know I certainly hear in my world of it takes too much time, I don't know where to begin, I don't know how to decide what to assess. And that one in particular is a big one. I don't know how to decide what to assess. And especially when you think about all the different ways that we can assess student achievement, student satisfaction, student engagement, how do we assess that? And so thinking about it from multiple levels, whether it be quantitative or qualitative, do you like this program or are you learning something from the program? And I'm going to talk quite a bit about our program at Front Range and the student learning outcomes that we have, and then how we're applying those to the student affairs side. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these 2 slides because I know you all have spent quite a bit of time around assessment, but just for you to know that these are things that you're going to hear, and they're out there in terms of why student affairs professionals are not doing assessment, but it's so critical that you do it in any of your programs from the beginning. And of course, the steps in assessment. And what I'm going to focus on today is a couple of the instruments that you may or may not, you probably are familiar with some of the things that we're using. But then primarily, how are we closing the loop on assessment? So as I mentioned before in the last slide, where to even begin with assessment? So when you're thinking about assessment, probably the number one question is, what's your problem? What is the problem that you're either trying to identify, that you're trying to figure out new ways to approach a situation? If you're finding that retention is not where you want it to be, how are you going to really look at the problem? Because retention is huge, right? When you think about retention, fall to fall retention, or what we look at persistence, fall to spring. When you look at that, that's a huge picture. So when you start getting into assessment, you really need to think about what is the problem that you're trying to solve. And that is where I think a lot of times assessments kind of go off onto a track that we're not really finding out what it is that we want to know because we're not really spending the time that we need to on the planning end. So defining the problem is really critical. Determining the purpose. We were just talking before, especially with me in enrollment management, there's a lot of stuff where I'll say, can you tell me about this? Can you pull this? Can you pull that? And you get to a point where you just have, I'll have this spreadsheet of students, and it'll be the students, and when did they start, and what is their GPA, and how many credit hours have they taken, and what program are they in, and when did they do this, and when did they do, and you get to the point where you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed. And so you really want to think about what it is that you want to know. So why are you collecting that data? Because I know our institutional research, especially only having 3 people who work in that department, that they don't have the time to just pull reports just for the sake of pulling reports. And so for me, I really have to think about what it is that I'm looking for. So an example would be one of the areas that we look at in terms of enrollment is our conversion funnel, which is the number of students who apply to our institution, but then the number of students who actually enroll. And so pulling that information is really important. And then to look at, okay, when are they enrolling? What programs are they enrolling in? And who's connecting with those students? And so really defining that program, just not application to enrollment conversion, but what am I going to do with that information is really important. And then to determine what assessment method do you want to use, because there are a lot of ways to collect information from students. What's the best way to do that? Or faculty or staff. One of the examples I'm going to show you is actually from our faculty. So again, determine who to study, how to collect it, the instrument, who should collect the data, how it should be analyzed, implications, and how to report the results effectively. So those pieces I'm going to spend more time on. One of the things that we found too, when you're thinking about doing any kind of research, we have an IRB as well at our institution. So anytime that we have any kind of work with our students in terms of surveys and those kinds of things, it goes through the IRB. And through that also what we found is that you can over-assess and over-survey your populations. And so really being aware of what others are doing across your division is really important as well. So that not only across your division, but within your department, what are the things that you're already looking for? Because you might find that someone else is asking for that same information. We had a situation where every fall we would have a currently enrolled student survey go out to our students. And so they would get bombarded with this pretty long survey that they had to fill out. And every year we're getting less and less students who are filling out this survey. And so we're starting to use this information, and we realize that it's a really small N of students. So one, why are we putting so much, why are we looking at this in a way where we're putting so much into what the students are saying when it's a really small percentage of our population? And we're wondering, well, why is our number just seem to get smaller and smaller? Well, we also found out that our system, so Front Range Community College is a part of a 13 community college system. Our system as a whole was also sending out a survey to all currently enrolled students at the same time. And so it was like, okay, we're getting overwhelmed by the number of surveys that are going out. Asking very similar information, but there were some specific things that we wanted to know as well. And so we had to figure out how we were going to do that differently. So for us, just like any institution, it's important for us to do assessment. It's important for us to do assessment because we want to understand what it is that we're doing. And then the other piece too, and this was one that I didn't really have an understanding of, is the Higher Learning Commission, which is one of the regional accrediting bodies. And so in the state of Colorado, we are a part of the region of HLC, which is the Higher Learning Commission. And what the Higher Learning Commission says is there are two components within their area, two criterion that specifically relate to assessment. And again, many times it's thought of as assessment related to academic, but yet it really has to be how the whole institution assesses the programs and services. And I'm going to show you that in just a minute. And then another really big area for us is performance funding. And so just like Colorado State University, Front Range Community College, we get funding from the state, and our funding is based on performance funding as well. The difference for us is that just like CSU has a board, Front Range Community College, as a part of the 13 community colleges, we also have a state board. And that state board looks at their own goals and objectives. And then we have requirements under those goals that may be completely different than what CSU has in regards to those goals. So our board may look at it and say, okay, you're going to increase retention by 1% over the next 5 years, year after year, or you're going to increase your graduation rates, or whatever that may be. We have to make sure that we're meeting those performance funding goals, because our money from the state trickles down to our state board, and then our state board determines how those 13 community colleges get funded. So if we're not meeting those performance funding metrics, then we may not get as much in terms of our COF funding that we would have gotten previously. For us, that's pretty significant, because as the largest community college in the state, we already get a smaller percentage of those funds because we have to support all of our community colleges across the state. And so it's really important that we have that as well. And if there's anything that I would want to make sure that you all think about as you go through this course and as you leave and as you go into your professional careers, is do not do assessment for the sake of assessment. And I say that because I'm also a peer reviewer for the Higher Learning Commission. And that's one of the things that I talk about when I'm going and visiting colleges as well, is it's the closing of the loop. There's a lot of assessment that we can be doing. There's a lot of assessment that we're doing at Front Range Community College. But if you're not closing the loop, then you're really doing assessment for the sake of assessment, and that's not really helping anyone. It's certainly not helping our students or our faculty and staff. And so that is important. So a little bit about HLC, and I'm not going to go too deep into this because it'll be like, but it is really interesting to think about how we are accredited and how assessment fits into that. So for us, we are regionally accredited, as I mentioned before, which means that students who take courses at Front Range Community College can transfer to Colorado State University, and we know we're accredited. We know that the courses that they take with us at Front Range are at an academic rigor, and our faculty have the credentials, and we've been assessing our programs to the point where you all or your faculty know that if our students take what we call English 121, which is our freshman English comp, that's comparable to your English comp here. And that's important because we want our students to be able to transfer and have seamless transfer. So we want to be accredited. If we're not accredited, then things like we don't get financial aid for our students, there's no federal grants. We basically have to close our doors if we're not accredited. So it's pretty important. And so there's two criterion within HLC that talk specifically about student affairs and assessment. And one of them is criterion 3. And what it talks about is making sure that we have high quality programs and services. And so the first thing that will happen is we'll look at this statement and say, okay, show us. Well, we have great programs. We have great programs. Our students love them. We have really, they come to our programs. So when you look at the number of students who come to programs, they really like them. Okay, but how do you know that they're effective? How do you know that they're high quality programs, right? Do they connect to learning outcomes that you may have at your college? So that's why, you know, we do assessment, because we want to know, right? We don't want to do assessment for the sake of doing assessment. We want to know, do we have effective, high quality programs for our students? Not just that they're going to those programs and they're, you know, it's like, you know, when you have a service and, you know, on your phone, all of a sudden, how was our service today? Happy face, sad face, right? You know? I mean, that's one way to get a survey. But what is that telling us? When you write back and you say, was it a happy face or a sad face? What is that telling us? Their satisfaction. Did they like what, you know, did they enjoy their time with us, right? But it's not necessarily telling us whether or not the program that we provided is meeting whatever learning outcome we've set for that. So in terms of, so this is one area that the Higher Learning Commission looks at, and really it's a good practice. It's not just that we should do this for accreditation. This is what our president is constantly telling us, is because we'll bring up and say, wow, you know, HLC, and it's like, you know what, it's not about accreditation. At the end of the day, it's about, is it the right thing to do? And it is the right thing to do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be asking us to do this. And so when you look at the different ways of assessing, you want to think about that we are asking for assessment not really to justify what we do, but to show that, to prove, if you will, to some extent, that the programs and services that we are offering are doing what we want them to do. And you'd be surprised, or I know I've been surprised and or amazed at times at programs that we do year after year after year, and we think that they're effective, and then we go in and we actually assess them and we realize, wow, we're really not getting the results that we thought we were. And so that's why it's important that we're doing that. And then you can see on the bottom too, it's also saying, okay, are we also training our staff? And are we assessing the training of our staff? And are we making sure that we have professional development for our staff and that we're assessing that as well? So it's really across the board in terms of that. So the other criterion, there's 5 criterion. Number 4 is the one that then really goes into the assessment of student learning. And this one I think is really, really critical because, again, it's about assessment beyond just the program and service that we offer, but how are we integrating it in our academic outcomes as well. So I'm going to share with you all our student learning outcomes, if I did this in the right way. Or maybe I didn't. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to hand out to you all is what we do at Front Range Community College. And we have a student learning committee that consists primarily of faculty. And we do have a couple of student services folks who sit on this as well. But this committee, over several years, I hope I have enough. 3, 4, yes I do, yay. Over the last couple of years, has looked at student learning outcomes. And those student learning outcomes are on 5 areas: critical thinking, effective communication, information and technological literacy, quantitative reasoning, and professionalism. And so what we have to do in terms of looking at assessment is, okay, we have these 5 student learning outcomes. How do we know that our students are learning these things? How do we know that our students are learning these things in the classroom? And how do we know that our students are learning these things outside of the classroom? And sometimes, in student affairs in particular, we look at these and we think, well, how do I assess critical thinking? in my role? How do I integrate that into the programs that I'm offering as a working in the residence halls or working in student life, working in conduct? I think there's some areas when you can look at it and say, okay, I can think about how I would integrate critical thinking into that. And others where it may be, okay, how does this fit into it? One of the areas, too, that came up recently for us was quantitative reasoning. And the staff saying, in student services, how are we going to make sure that quantitative reasoning is something that we can assess? Well, the majority of our students are on financial aid. A lot of our students take out loans. Many of them do not understand financial literacy. So how do we incorporate financial literacy into our programs around financial aid and managing being a student, not only from the classroom perspective and socially, but also in terms of being able to handle it from a budgetary perspective? There's quantitative reasoning in there. So how do we think about it in that way? So for us, we're looking at our student learning outcomes, and then we have to take them down to the classroom point. And so you look at it from that English composition course, which of these are being incorporated into that course, and how are they being assessed? But then also in co-curricular, we have to look at the student learning outcomes. Our staff came back and said, we want our own student learning outcomes. And we were like, well, let's talk about that. Why do you want your own student learning outcomes? Wouldn't it make sense for us to have the same student learning outcomes across the college? And for them, it was that struggle of looking at those outcomes as they related to student services. So our staff got together in our student learning committee, and they came up with this idea. This is draft. I should have put draft right there. Draft, because they're still looking at this. But one of the ideas is to do a pre-assessment with all of our students when they come in for advising. So for us, for a first-time student coming into advising, they have a new advising hold. So they can't register for classes until they meet with an advisor. And it's a great opportunity for our staff then to collect some data from students that are coming in. And so the idea is that when the student comes in, we would have them go ahead and just kind of rate right now, where do they see themselves in terms of those 5 student learning outcomes, asking 2 questions each. Again, some of these may be things that are specific more to the classroom, but yet getting them thinking on the front end, what is it that they need to know to be a college student? What are the things that they need to know as they come in for everything that they're doing? Because there are times when you, again, with financial aid, where you need to use mathematical calculations to solve problems, right? If you use 80% of your financial aid dollars in the first week, you're going to have a mathematical problem. So you better be able to solve that. Or analyze and apply numerical information, right? Work well with others. Acting professionally. All of these things are important for students to know. And so we're looking at this at the front end. And then when the student graduates, one of the things we ask our students to do is complete a graduation application. And so when they do that, is to then ask these questions again and be able to look at where do they think they are in terms of those 2 things. So this would be one way that we're hoping to close the loop around those student learning outcomes and start to see it from a very broad perspective. Now, one of the other ways that that we need to look at it is really digging deep into what one of these may look like. So I'm going to use critical thinking. I don't have any of this. Here we go. So one of the things that our Student Learning Committee has been doing is every year they have this thing called Assessapalooza. I know you're all like, Assessapalooza? How do I sign up? No. But one of the things I can tell you about that is I had the opportunity to attend the all-day, it's an all-day conference that they put on, and faculty and staff come in and talk about the student learning outcomes and how they're using them in the classroom. And to me, again, it's just a great opportunity to start to see the faculty side of how assessment plays a role in the classrooms and then how we can apply it on the student services side as well. And so one of our faculty members was talking about critical thinking and the different ways that we can think about critical thinking. How do we solve problems? And what I started thinking about was so many times in student affairs, one of the things that we use is we'll use the MBTI, or we'll use colors, or we'll use something in some type of temperament type theory instrument when working with students, or maybe even around learning styles. And when you think about critical thinking has a component around how you learn and how you do the things that you do. So when we're even thinking about planning programs or the services that we offer, critical thinking can come into it because we have to even acknowledge the fact that our students are approaching problems from different perspectives, right? From different angles. How do they look at solving those problems? For some of our students, they want to read the information. They want to understand the information, and then they'll approach the problem, right? For some of our students, their critical thinking happens by being in a dialogue with someone else, by having that discourse of ideas that can come together to really fully understand and analyze a problem that they have. And so just even understanding those different ways that we can offer the programs that we have, and then thinking about how our students are analyzing that information and what are they learning from that. Because we know as students are going through that development and each stage throughout each year of their academic time here, they're thinking about things differently, right? The way that they're thinking about it from a critical thinking perspective is different from that first day as a first-year student coming in until they graduate. And so what are the different benchmarks that we can even think about from a critical thinking perspective, from a communication perspective, from a quantitative reasoning perspective, that we can use those outcomes as well? And I'm sure Colorado State has learning outcomes, that general education learning outcomes, that you can even look at in terms of what that would mean in terms of the programs that you have. These are fairly general, and a lot of institutions have very similar outcomes. Do you have some?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we had our accreditation from HLC a few years ago, and one of the comments from the accreditors was that in student affairs, we on this campus collect a lot of data. We understand to the nth degree about participation in our programs, satisfaction in our programs, but the point was raised that we don't always integrate student learning outcomes into the assessment that we do in student affairs. And so this is one area that we're trying to really get our handle on too.
And that is very typical. I mean, again, because in student services, we will do surveys of our students in programs. How do you like the program? You know, as opposed to what did you learn from the program? And that's, it's not just finding out what did they learn, and then but it's also then coming back around and saying, okay, now how do we apply this again? Because if you think that a student is going to be in a program and learn about time management, and then you ask them those questions around time management, and you find out that really they didn't learn what you wanted them to learn about how to organize their time, or what's the best time for them of the day in terms of going to class, or those kinds of things. If they're not learning that, then you need to revamp your program. And you need to show that you've done that. But how do they relate to those learning outcomes? So I'm going to show you one of, so let me step back for just a minute. So for us, what we were finding was just that we have a lot of assessments out there, but we're not looking at what those assessments are telling us, that we're not closing the loop on them. And we don't always know if we're assessing our student learning outcomes. So we're starting to do that. And I have someone right now who's working on we call them open assessments, and I'm sharing with you an example of one of our open assessments. We have about 30 to 40 different assessments that have happened across the college and student services over the past 2 years. And they're all out there all over the place. Some of them have like a 200-page study on them. Some are just a couple of pages. Some they've never looked at the data. And so what we have asked is that all of these assessments, all of these assessments get put on a piece of paper or put into a program that asks these different questions. So our questions are very similar to what you saw in the very beginning. What is our problem? What do we want to do? So the different things that we're asking in this is, and actually I have two, look at that. First of all, we want to know what is the title and who's the project lead. And for this, it was our Boulder County campus, which is in Longmont. It's a testing center survey. It's in our testing center. And for us, we have a testing center under student services. And the testing center provides a couple of key services for our students. First of all, because we have mandatory placement in the state of Colorado, we're required as a community college to have a lot more placement exams for students than, say, you are at Colorado State University. Because the idea is that the students coming to CSU are college ready. They're coming in here and they're ready for English Comp and they're ready for college algebra. At the community college, we're open access, which means that students can be coming in at any level. And for us to know what level they're at and whether or not they're college ready, as opposed to needing to take an extra course just to get them up to college level, we are required by the state to test all of our students in some way. It can be ACT, SAT, but most of the time the students are not coming in with the ACT, SAT scores to get them into college level. And so we just actually moved to a new test called the Community College Placement Test. But all of our students who don't meet those requirements then have to test. So our testing center sees a lot of students, especially as we're getting ready for registration and enrollment. And then our testing center also sees students who had to miss an exam, if they have accommodations for exams and those kinds of things, which is similar to here as well. So this particular project, we're asking them to provide us with the purpose. So they really have to think about it. Now, should this have been on the front end? And hopefully our folks thought about this when they put together the survey. We hope so, that they thought about the purpose and what it is that they were trying to find out. And so for this particular one, it was to gather feedback from faculty. Because a lot of times we think that our customer, if you will, is the student. And certainly our customer is the student. But the faculty, we work with a lot of faculty, and making sure that we're providing the best service to our faculty is important. Because if the faculty have what they need, then our students are going to get what they need as well. And so they surveyed the faculty. They did it over a short period of time, as you can see on here. They had one time that they did the assessment. It was a satisfaction survey. At this point in time, this particular person did not think that it met any of the SLOs, but we're going to go back and review those to determine, well, did it really meet one of the student learning outcomes? It's a little bit different because it's a faculty survey again, as opposed to a student one. But even within a faculty survey, did we meet one of our student learning outcomes? One of the things that we want to know. And then we're asking them to give us a summary of the results. So what are some of the, first of all, what did you do within this assessment? And so you'll see on here there were some different things that is helpful for someone who's looking at this assessment to know. But then what were your takeaways? And so on the back side, you'll see there are a couple of main takeaways from this. One is that they feel like they're providing high quality of service to faculty. So good, satisfaction, they're providing high quality. The primary reason for using the testing center from a faculty's perspective is that students can make up missed exams. What's interesting about that is about 80% of the exams that we give in the testing center are for placement, not for missed exams. And so our faculty, though, that's where they're coming from, is thinking, well, this is for a missed exam. So is there an opportunity to educate the faculty around all the different things that the testing center are doing? I will tell you right now, they definitely know what our testing center does, because we just, as I mentioned, implemented this community college placement test. Huge shift in how we're placing students across all of our community colleges in the state. Total change in how we're doing developmental education. It used to be that our students would need to take, if they tested the lowest level math, they would have 4 math classes before they even got to college algebra. And now they have 1 math class to get them up to where they need to be, whether they're going what we call the STEM way or the quant way. And so the STEM way is going to be your college algebra toward calculus way, or quant way, which is toward statistics and business math. And so for our students and for our faculty, it's a huge shift. So our faculty have been very involved in that. So it'd be interesting to do this again, knowing that that occurred, because this survey was done in 2014. And then what were some of the areas to think about? Well, they're saying their survey population might have been too small. What I really like about that is, again, when I shared the example of our currently enrolled student survey, it would be really easy to take that survey and say, see what our students are saying? Instead of digging into it and realizing, wow, this is a really small population of students. And it's really skewed toward female students. In fact, I think on one of our last surveys, it was like 70% of all the survey respondents were female. So you start to look at that and you realize, well, this isn't really, is this assessment that we want to use? Well, maybe not, But were there some things that came out of it that we want to dig into deeper? And so one of the things from that last survey that we looked at was that we wanted to know more about social media uses for our students. How do students get information? Do they get it through their smartphone? What percentage of students have a smartphone at a community college? Are they using that? Do they want to use it as an app? Do they want a text message? Do they want it as an email? And so we were able to take that and then bring it down to a smaller survey that we wanted to find specifically about students. So what we're asking on this is each of over the last 2 years, we're asking all our areas that did some assessment to fill out something like this. And then we're putting that on a matrix to look at it and say, okay, are we assessing the things that we should be assessing? Have we closed the loop on some of these? What does this tell us? Or did we do anything with this? Or did we just say, oh, we did a survey, we're good? But what is it that we want to know from that survey? So any questions so far about what we're doing? Kind of went ahead of myself on this. Okay, the other one that I wanted to share with you all is not only then really targeted through student services, but also the fact that we do some national benchmarking and national surveys as well. And it's the same kind of thing where we want to make sure that not only our student affairs folks know what those surveys are telling us, but also that our faculty know and certainly our administration know as well. And so over the last couple of years at Front Range, we have implemented a couple of those national surveys. One is the CESI. Anyone familiar with the CESI? Might be familiar with NESI. So CESI is the Community College Survey of Student Engagement. So, which is really interesting to look at. In fact, there's some community colleges in 4 years who have done some work together looking at CESI results and NESI results and how those relate. We have a really great transfer population from our Front Range campus here in Larimer that come to Colorado State, so that may be something that we want to look at. Yes, it's a very, this is our #1 transfer institution, is to CSU. Bless you. So we did the CESI 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago. That was our kind of our benchmarking of looking at the community college survey of student engagement. And then we also did the SFESI, which is, I know all these acronyms. What do you think that might be, the SFESI? It is the Community College Survey of Faculty Engagement. So we had our faculty do the survey, and we had our community college students do the survey. And the cool thing about doing the SESI or the NESI is that it's, well, the positive, and sometimes it could be negative as well, I'm going to tell you about that in just a minute, is that it's not an online survey. So students can't choose to take the SESI. It actually happens in the classroom. So you have an audience of students that have to take this if they're in class. So we have about 1,100 students who took the SESI. And then on the faculty side, it is a link for faculty to take it, but we know if they've taken it or not, so we can keep sending them, did you take it? So what's really interesting about the SESI and the SPESI is that you can look at what faculty, some of the questions are related to how faculty think students are prepared, did they have an opportunity to be collaborative in the classroom or outside the classroom, what are we doing in the classroom? And then the students also answer a whole lot of questions, not only about their classroom environment, but also about the services that we provide, the programs that we provide, and how those relate to what they call high impact practices. So things like students are registered by the first day of class. Students attend a mandatory new student orientation. Students are engaged in a first year experience program. Students come to class prepared. Students feel like they have an opportunity to interact with faculty outside the classroom. So those are some of the questions that the SESI will ask. So for Front Range Community College, when we did the SESI in 2012, we looked at that and we knew some of the high impact practices and some of the things that we need to be doing, but we weren't making sure that students were enrolled by the first day of class. Most of our students were, but there were quite a few students who were not necessarily in their class by the first day of class, and we knew that was something that we wanted to look at. We also knew that a large majority of our students did not attend mandatory new student orientation. We had a new student orientation. It wasn't mandatory. If you could go, you know, great kind of thing. So from the college's perspective, we looked at the SESI results, which told us, which we kind of knew, that we weren't doing those things. And the other one that was really low for us was in tutoring. And it asked the question, do you know that tutoring is available, or have you had an opportunity to tutor others? And so we looked at that across the college, and we actually formed a couple of task forces that looked at things like mandatory new student orientation, looked at making sure that students, that late registration was something that we really looked at. And then the other one that we looked at was a student success course for students. And so we had some task forces that looked at that. And so they've been reviewing what we can do across the college and had brought forward proposals to the college in those areas as well. Since then, we then formed a student success task force across our entire college that went out and looked at other colleges that, in a sense, scored, it's not the right word, but that their students have a higher rating for each of those areas. So we looked at other colleges across the country. We looked at colleges who've won awards across the country for these things. And we came back and we said, okay, here are the things that we want to do at Front Range Community College. And so this year, we're embarking on a journey to say, okay, how can we make this happen across 3 major different campuses with 30,000 students, some of them who are online, to require that all of our students are in class by the first day of class, to make sure that we have opportunities for priority registration for our students, that all of our students have a mandatory new student orientation, that they have mandatory student success course, that they have academic pathways to be successful, that we're providing the support that they need to be successful in those areas. So for us, we took one aspect of an assessment across the whole college and looked at it and said, okay, how does this inform what we're doing now and how we want to be better? And so we just did the SESI again, and it's moving us in the right direction. We know that these are the things that we need to be doing. So it's going to be our benchmark, and so it's our college-wide assessment that we're looking at, where it takes the student affairs side and the academic affairs side and pulls them together in terms of understanding what it is that we need to do best for our students. And I could spend an entire another class just talking about what we're doing with all of our student success committee stuff. But one of the things that I think is really exciting about it is for each of those high impact practices that we're doing, we're calling them I-teams, implementation teams. For each of them, it's a student services and a faculty or an instructional person who are co-leading every one of those teams. And then the college-wide steering committee is also being co-led with an instructional person and a student services person. So that no matter what we're implementing, all of these things that on the surface you may think, well, is that student services or is that instruction? You know, when you look at mandatory new student orientation, who should be responsible for that? Is it student services? Is it instruction? And for us, what we're saying is it's not either and, it's both, right? That if we're going to be effective, if we are really going to provide the best opportunity for our students, then our students need to know what is the career, the pathway that they want to come into on the very beginning, and how do our faculty get involved in those new student orientations as well. So whether it be a student success course, a new student orientation, any of those, that they're both involved. And then what we're putting on top of that is those student learning outcomes. So we're not just leaving those out here and saying, well, yeah, those student learning outcomes are over there. Within each of those implementation teams, we're saying, okay, and we're actually calling mandatory new student orientation, we're calling it our onboarding process. So from the first moment that a student is being onboarded into coming to front range, and some people, do you like that? Some people don't like that's the terminology that's being used more and more, onboarding. Some people like it, some people don't. You're like, no. It's a very corporate word, so that's why sometimes people are like, really? You know, they use it a lot in corporations. We're going to onboard you. But the idea is that from that beginning stage on, that we will be looking at how those student learning outcomes are then integrated into it so that we're assessing what the students are learning from the very beginning, we're incorporating those student learning outcomes from the very beginning, and we're making sure that we're assessing it in a way where it's both the student services side and the instructional side together. So I know I've been talking a lot. Okay, good. So questions. I wanted to leave some time to get your feedback about what we're doing, how we're doing assessment, how we're using assessment. What is it like at a community college? Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So the question is why, so when we're looking at developmental education, the success of developmental education, did we use assessment to make the changes that we've made, and what does that look like? So what happened for us, and this was very much entrenched in assessment as well, is that about, gosh, it's been almost 3 years ago now, across the Colorado Community College system, we brought together instruction and student services across all of our colleges to start looking at developmental education assessment, which was abysmal. I mean, when you looked at students who tested into the very lowest math, which again is a math 030, they have math 030, 060, 090, 099, then they get into college algebra. 4 semesters of classes. So you can imagine, if you get through the first module, if you even make it to register for the second module, it's less than 50% for each of those. So by the time you get to the end, you're lucky if, I think it was like 6% of students were progressing. So we knew that that was a big issue. It also had been a pretty big issue across the country. A lot of different college systems and colleges were looking at DevEd and how we were doing DevEd. So our system took a pretty aggressive approach to it and brought in experts from all over the country that were trying different things, really looked at what those programs were, spent a lot of time researching and assessing what were the best practices, even going out to those colleges, which is what we did for our college as well, going out and looking at what colleges were doing, how is it being successful. And what they did was they took different different programs and they put them together. So an example would be for our math now, again, determining which math class a student goes into. The test that they take, everyone takes the first kind of battery of a test. And then depending on whether or not you're going into college algebra, which would be things like your degree with designation, which would be an Associate of Science in Math, so that you can transfer to CSU and transfer in as a junior in the math department, you're going to take the college algebra route. Or you could have a student take more of that quant weight, what we call quant weight route, which would be statistics, business math. You're getting an AA in business. You don't need college algebra. So depending on the program that you're in, you need to have statistics. And so have them go in that direction as well. So that's the math portion of it. We also took, before students had to take an English course and a reading course, 2 different courses. And it could take them 2 or 3 semesters to get to English Comp. Again, what we did was we looked at it, and it's one course that a student would be required to take. There's multiple ways that they can do it. One is they can take a developmental English course with a college level course together, kind of like a learning community. They can also take 6 credit hours in one semester. They take the Dev Ed course and the English Comp course all in the same semester. And the success rates, because a lot of assessments is going on to look back on it, the success rates of those programs is phenomenal. Our students are progressing quicker, they're more prepared for their next level classes, because what happened was the faculty who are teaching those math and English courses were communicating with the faculty who are teaching the Dev Ed courses to make sure that they were really aligned for what the student needed to know. And not to go into English Comp and expect the student to be able to write the best paper. You know, it's like, what do we need to do to provide those support skills for the student? So not only was it changing the curriculum, but it was also changing the support mechanisms. So for some of those courses, we have embedded advising. For some of those courses, we have embedded tutoring. For some of those courses, our math in particular, they embedded study skills. Many of the students in math in particular, it was just like, math is hard. You know, it's like, it's one of those where math is, you just go into it thinking I can't do math. And yet what we found was that for a lot of students, it was just understanding how to study. And so teaching them the skills to know how to study math really made a huge difference for those students. So even though it's only been implemented for about 1.5 years, we're already seeing huge strides in terms of persistence for students. Big difference between needing only 1 semester to get to college ready as opposed to those 4. So very much ingrained in assessment in terms of determining what we move toward.
And so there's Department of Higher Education, big conversation now about credit for prior learning. And that is heavily based in outcomes assessment in terms of if you come in with an AP score of a 3, is that, does that really prepare you for success in those courses down the road? And so institutions are being asked to come to the table with their assessment so that we can decide, do we need to accept a 3? Should everyone accept a 3? Should you accept a 3 for non-majors, but if you're going to go into a math degree that you need to have a 4 or a 5 in your AP, everyone has to come to the table with the assessment, with the data to back it.
And that's huge for us because right now what happens is a student comes to us and they'll use prior learning assessment, so IB score, AP score, any of those, may get a degree from us. But if they then transfer to CSU and CSU says, yeah, but for us, you need to have a 4. So we're not going to take that. You need to redo that class. Well, that's huge, right? And so just having the conversation across all of the Colorado Department of Higher Ed is, for us, a really big deal so that our students will know what can be accepted for both IB and AP in particular, and for CLEP. But then this conversation about the major, non-major is one for us is going to be difficult to try to figure out, because if you do have a student who's getting a DWD in math, they come in with an AP score in calculus maybe that we're going to take, and then it may not be accepted when they transfer. We don't know what that's going to look like, but there are a lot of things in the state of Colorado in particular where both our legislators and our Department of Higher Ed has a lot of input in how we do what we do. Another big area they're looking at is that pathways component. But it's all ingrained in assessment. It's looking at why do you want it to be a 4? Why can't it be a 3? You have to show us why that needs to be a 4 instead of a 3. It can't be just because we think students will do better if they have a 4. That's not a good enough reason, right? We want to know, where's the data to back that up? If you can show us that students who get a 4 or 5 perform significantly better than students who have a 3, then we'll look at that. And that's important that we have that information. We're not just making decisions, but we're actually making decisions based on the data that we can provide. So, does that answer your question? I know you can tell this is something I can talk a lot about. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Does a SESI, we call
SESI.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Does it focus on like the preparedness or like students' confidence from the transition from a 2-year university to a 4-year university?
It doesn't in the SESI. And I don't know in the NESI if it does that, because that would be the 4-year, and I don't think it really talks about transfer. That's a really good point to try to bring in. We've, like I said, we haven't done this, but some other community colleges with 4 years have been able to track the students in terms of their student engagement from the community college to the 4-year, which I think is really interesting as well. But that's a really good point to bring in the transfer questions, to have something like that that looks at that. The other one is that I was going to mention is, as I said, SESI and NESI are both in-person assessment surveys that the student has to take. The Center for Community College Engagement and then from the NESI also has been trying to figure out how to do an online survey for students. So we were a pilot school this year for the SOCI, just so we get another one out there. For the online student engagement survey. And so it's the survey of online student engagement. And unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of response because, again, it's one of those where the student has to click on the link to do it, and we just find students don't do that primarily. And so we didn't have really a large enough N to be able to look at the data, but it was great that they're thinking about that they're starting. So they're always looking at ways, what do we need to know about students? And I think understanding our transfer student is a big one. It's also an area that the Community College Research Center is really starting to spend a lot of time on, is the transfer initiatives. And what does it mean for our students, especially looking at like Front Range to CSU. As Laura said, we have, in fact, concurrently enrolled students, we have 500 plus concurrently enrolled students, which means they're taking classes here and classes at Front Range at the same time. And then the number of students that come here to transfer is huge. And I know over the years we've had the transfer center and those things, which is really coming out of the fact that we have a lot of transfer students coming in. And so how do we look at the progression of those students and their success? And we do find that here in particular, because CSU does do a really good job working with our students are successful, which is great. Not necessarily the case across the country when students transfer, because that pathway isn't always there for them. But we have a really, between our degrees with designation and having the support here, we do have that for our students, which is great. So, yeah?
I have a question about your comments around closing the loop. And from what I understood, it was, why are we doing this assessment? Does it have meaning? Is it informing our work? Mm-hmm. Well, aren't there times, though, that you might start out thinking this assessment is going to inform what we think, but then, in fact, it's not in control and you have the results? Mm-hmm. So closing the loop can actually be now what do we do going forward to better answer the questions that we have and what have we learned
Yeah.
from that assessment? So it's not always
Positive, yeah.
Yeah.
And what I have found interesting and informative are from faculty who've been able to put some of those assessments into their classroom and really identifying, where they thought the student was understanding. Like, a lot of times we say, oh, well, the exams do that, right? Well, exams tell you part of the story, but not necessarily always the full picture. And listening to some of the faculty talking about closing the loop when that happens, and they're like, oh my gosh, I've always taught this way. I have taught this class for 10 years this way. And I had no idea that only 3% of the students understood this concept, So you're absolutely, it's both. And sometimes you do the assessment and you're like, I got no answers, in terms of what I thought I wanted to assess. I am not getting that information. So then you have to rethink it and say, okay, what is it that I really want to know? The other one on assessment that happens is, we certainly get this because our college, again, we have 3 different campuses. They're really different. And so if we do any kind of college-wide assessment, SESI's an example, well, that's not our campus, Well, that data, that must have been for those students, right? So really knowing and understanding the data and being okay with the data telling you something that you didn't expect. And not to make excuses about it, but to really own it and say, okay, then if I think it was only this group of students, how do I find out what these students over here think? And to then look at that assessment in a different way. Because sometimes you don't want to accept what the data is telling you either. So. I'm sorry? Oh, the original question was sometimes when you close the loop that it's not always what you expected or a positive outcome. And so realizing that, then what does that mean in terms of what's the next assessment? Or do I need to do things differently because it didn't give me the information that I needed? So, yeah.
I'm just wondering about what kind of training you give the students or the staff or that's available for them, especially if they're doing like these sports and they're working with, all of these different materials you're providing them. Are they getting training to actually do assessment properly?
They are. Great question. So the question is, are we providing professional development and training for student services staff to do these assessments? So probably we joined an assessment academy probably 4 years ago. And within that, there's a 2-day assessment training that we had a lot of faculty go through. And then we were like, wait a second, our student services staff need to know how to do this too. And so we offer a 2-day training. It occurs twice a year, where any student services staff can attend or any faculty member can attend, and they get this huge binder, and it takes them through Assessment 101. And it's everything from what is your problem, why assess, what does research look like, how do you do research, what is a survey versus an ethnography versus, it goes through everything for the staff to look at what they want to do. And then within that, those 2 days, they also have to leave with a project. So what is it that they want to assess? How are they going to do it? And then they have a mentor who helps them throughout that entire assessment the first time they do it. And then they also have a data specialist. So they kind of have this team to help work with them on doing assessment. So it's actually a really, it's a great way for anyone who's, like, well, I'm thinking about assessment, but I'm not quite sure, to have really a team help them through that and do that professional development. So. And that's where most of these came from, because then they were like, whether it be a little mini survey or a really big project that our staff wanted to do, it really came out of those sessions. So, yeah.
Do you guys keep some sort of log, or how do you keep track of all the surveys that are going on to make sure that you're not doing multiple surveys at one time?
Mm-hmm. So the question was, how do we keep track of all the surveys that come in? One of the, not as well as we'd like to, we just purchased some software to do that. So we just purchased eLumen. And so I don't know how that's going to work yet because we just purchased it. And it's a software that's one of the reasons why these are all being put into this kind of a document, and we're doing it on OneNote so that they can easily then input this into this repository of all the assessments that are going on. What I have asked is that the person who's doing that to also put it on, I don't have an example, I thought I had it, more like a matrix, where you can look across and say for each one, but then you could delve deeper if you want to. But all of our projects, all of our assessment projects go through the Student Learning Committee. So there is a repository, but it's like this massive matrix of different assessments that are going on. Because there are a lot of assessments that are happening in the classroom that our faculty are doing that we don't even know about. And so trying to collect all of that, and it's going to be a lot of work over this next year to do that. So, but we're looking at software to help us. It'll be big. And then my retired person who's doing my assessment project for me. Like, please get this done by the end of December. So, any other questions? I know I went over, but anything? Oh, great. Well, thank you. Hopefully this was informative and